Good evening. It was the late Tory MP Alan Clark, whose louche reputation was hard-earned, taken to task on this programme, I think, for making unwanted approaches to women, famously replied, "How do I know they're unwanted until I make them?" He lived in different times, of course, but were they worse than today? Does the bout of moralising at Westminster and elsewhere about powerful men's attitudes to generally younger women reflect a heightened ethical sensibility, loftier standards of behaviour? Or is it a moral mood swing that cannot distinguish between harassment and assault that was always deplorable and clumsiness that's embarrassing but essentially harmless? Once, slavers were pillars of the community and homosexuals were beheaded. Now a succession of prime ministers apologise for the slave trade, and only this week Nicola Sturgeon's done so on behalf of her Scottish government to those homosexuals convicted under publicly approved laws of the land, now repealed. Clear signs of moral progress? What about money? Does this week's furore over legal offshore holdings show we are less tolerant of unfairness or just enjoy bashing the rich, the top 1% of whom pay 27% of all income tax after all? We've a budget coming up. We used to think debt was wrong or at least a dangerous moral hazard. Now the average household owes £57,000 and on top government debt amounts to £25,000 more for every man, woman and child. We don't seem to care. Liberation or profligacy? Our notions of right and wrong are changing rapidly and radically. Does this show we are becoming better people? Or are there merely fashions in morality, our truths all relative, not eternal, and we're no better than our ancestors? That's our Moral Maze tonight. The panel, Melanie Phillips, social commentator on The Times, Claire Fox from the Institute of Ideas, Anne McElvoy, senior editor at The Economist, and the chief executive of the RSA, Matthew Taylor. Melanie, Sexminster, I think they're calling it. Is this a sign our values are improving, or is it a witch hunt?
I think it's a sign of the moral confusion of the times. I think we're living in an age which has collapsed all moral boundaries. A lot of people, particularly men, no longer know the codes by which they're supposed to live in terms of sexual behaviour. And some of the consequences are appalling. Some of them have been exaggerated, but men are confused. I think we're all confused. I don't think it's possible to say we're better or worse. I think certainly what we can say with certainty is that there's been moral change.
Matthew Taylor?
I think the effects of the Westminster sex pest saga are mainly positive, but also in some ways problematic. But that's the way social change happens. 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back. And it's also how, on the whole, in liberal democracies, public morality over the long term does improve.
Anne McElvoy.
Well, Westminster, or Pestminster as it's become, is a very good example of a place that lived with bad behaviour for a long time. And when that changes, it can feel very traumatic. But I think it's part of a long journey of social progress. Bumps in the road, all sorts of weird 3-point turns, and some accidents along the way. But I'm going to perhaps stick to my guns as an old-fashioned Whig on this one and say that we are getting morally better.
Claire Fox.
I don't think we want to confuse moral progress with puritanical intolerance, and I fear that that's one of the things that's emerged at the moment. You know, you can feel as though you're kind of on the side of virtue if you shout "burn the witch" and identify things as evil, and you know, you can feel better about yourself, but whether it makes you a morally autonomous, responsible person, I doubt it.
OK, panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Peter Hitchens, the writer and broadcaster, who wrote a column saying the Westminster sex scandal was ridiculously out of proportion, comparing what he called the squawkers with militant Islamists and generating a warm flood of approval on Twitter. I am being ironic, of course. More generally, is this a sign of an improvement in our moral attitudes, do you think?
Well, not in our moral attitudes. No, I am a proud Victorian prude, and I've disapproved of these actions all the time, and disapprove of lots of other coarsenesses and unpleasantnesses which seem to me to have increased greatly in our culture and our country in the past 40 or 50 years, and I think it's a shame that they've happened. It's funny that they came in step with, but not necessarily as a consequence of the growing feminist movement, which has, in my view, taken a rather ambiguous, ambivalent view of them and seemed not to be against for instance, the spread of pornography and the general laxness in language and the use of filthy words, which has become very common, amongst other things, on the radio. And I've been amazed at this decay. I can't think we can call it progress.
And McElvoy.
Regardless of whether you approve of what's happening in terms of the backlash at the moment, Peter, do you think that it's a sign that we take more seriously things that were buried, things that were hidden away. We have a greater awareness of unfairnesses and biases, and that's actually a form of moral progress.
No, I think it's a sign that people like to show off their allegedly good credentials by sounding good in public an awful lot and going on about the misdoings of others, which has always been a very pleasant occupation, but doesn't have much to do with good behaviour. I think what we've lost is a code of good behaviour which people adopted themselves and learnt, particularly the code of courtship which surrounded lifelong marriage, which has been entirely lost, which made relations between men and women much more, not perfect, I'm not a utopian, but much more civilised in many ways than they are now. We've lost it, and to go on and on about the fact that people put their hands on people's knees and make grabs at people, which I disapprove of as much as anybody, as if by going on about it you made yourself morally superior, is absurd. It's yet another instance of our desire to appear to be good rather than to do good.
Well, I would agree that you have to be able to discriminate between the different charges and the moral importance that we attach to them, but surely going on about things is actually a sign of moral concern. People went on about things that were wrong for a long time before society got round to putting them right. You think about the women's vote, you think about slavery as very convenient examples of that, but there are many others. Banging on about things is part of what it means to be engaged morally.
Depends on the aim of the going on about. If the aim of the going on about is to obtain political advantage and to drive your political opponents into a corner by embarrassing them, then no. If the aim of it is to improve personal behaviour, then yes, but I don't get any sense there's any serious aim of improving personal behaviour in our society now.
Well, that's what I want to come to. More broadly, we can agree to differ on whether Pestminster...
No, I never do that.
No, it's about time. Let's have a run at it. But even if you don't, what about the other things? We know that there are many things that you might think would be moral progress. I might disagree. Sometimes we'll coincide.
No, I don't think
we'll
there's
differ.
any such thing as moral progress.
What even is an idea?
Where do we get the idea from that the motion is forward? Where is this strange ometer which allows us to tell whether something is progress or just a change? It seems to me the only way you can tell is whether things deteriorate in a serious way in the long run as a consequence of it.
Very briefly on that, surely the sign, whether you think we're going backwards, I think we're going forwards, or we meet in the middle,
neither.
Isn't it part of a liberal democracy that we accept, because we're not autocrats, we accept that we win some, we lose some. Some things are going to frustrate you in morality, some are going to frustrate me, and that's okay.
No, a free society, everybody, whatever their agreements and disagreements, has an ultimate interest in the good, and morality is aimed at obtaining the good, and everybody should be agreed on a basic morality which moves towards the good. We are not agreed on that at the moment.
Matthew Ten.
You bemoan many of the effects of unbridled individualism, and I share some of your concerns, but we, the people, in the end, chose to have extra freedoms, extra rights. I don't see much sign of us wanting to give them up. So why do you think we're getting this wrong? Why do you think we are choosing things which don't in the end work for us?
Well, you say that we, the people, did it. In fact, for instance, the Roy Jenkins Cultural Revolution, which is a very mixed grill of changes in our life, was not obtained through popular demand.
No,
it was almost all done through private members' bills.
But we could have reversed it since.
None of it was ever discussed at a general election, and mostly it was the action of an elite, very much fueled by the BBC, which propelled the ideas of Bloomsbury into an enormously greater power than they would ever have had without it.
I understand that, and I know your strong views about the
Well, forget about strong views and bemoaning. Just address me as if I were a normal human being instead of a freak.
I'm trying to get to the point here, which is, you think we went wrong in the 60s. We've had 50 years to realise that we've gone wrong and to choose to reverse it. But I don't see much...
No, because the same people who made the mistakes are still in charge, and one thing they will not do, and this is quite common in people who've made a big mistake, is admit that they made one. And so we carry on making the same one over and over again. The bashing of the head against the wall continues relentlessly.
An alternative view might be that individualism is, in historic terms, quite a recent phenomenon for human beings. Is it not possible that we are learning to handle freedom? You know, teenage pregnancy rates have halved, divorce rates are now coming down. Isn't it possible that we will learn to handle freedom better?
What you refer to as freedom is actually the strong desire for personal autonomy, which is not the same thing. All freedom is actually pursued at the expense of other people's freedom, and these freedoms likewise have been pursued at the expense of the freedoms of people who don't necessarily think those things are good. Nor do I think that the thing that you name, teenage pregnancy, is necessarily the recent fall in it as a result of any kind of moral improvement, much more the result of increasing use of the morning after pill to prevent people becoming pregnant. The figures on sexually transmitted diseases suggest that the problem is still quite considerable.
I suppose what I'm trying to get to is that you have a view of a kind of inexorable downward spiral.
No.
Isn't it possible to say
No, I don't have a
isn't
view
it
of inexorable. It's completely exorable if only intelligent people would recognise that mistakes have been made.
But isn't it possible, therefore, to see human development as a kind of dialectic whereby we make progress, we overreach, we learn from the fact we've overreached, and then we develop and then we mature? And so in that sense, moral development is a perfectly reasonable aspiration for us
Or
to
you
have.
could say that there were actually some quite serious moral propositions which most people agreed with and followed until quite recently, in which they've now abandoned in the name of individual autonomy, and that the results are plain for all to see. Those who are rich and powerful and safe get on fine. Those who aren't suffer.
Peter Hitchens, thanks very much indeed.